Well, it's certainly been an eventful week. And so the topic of this session, the intersection of racism and anti-Semitism, historical perspectives and current issues, seems particularly salient as the diverse communities that make up our polity seek to better understand each other, and we hope to move forward together. And we are really fortunate to have two wonderful expert panelists to lead our discussion. Before I introduce them, let me just go over the format for today's session. After I introduce the panelists, each of them will speak for about 10 or 12 minutes, and we'll then open the floor to questions and discussion. With that, let me introduce our panelists. So Dr. Lauren Strauss is a scholar in residence and director of undergraduate studies in the Jewish Studies program at American University, right here in Washington. Her courses include surveys of ancient and modern Jewish history and literature, modern Israel, Israel and American Jews, and Jews and the American political tradition. She's also currently senior historical consultant for the forthcoming Capitol Jewish Museum, which is scheduled to open in DC in 2022. She's written several books. She's the co-editor of the book, Mediating Modernity, Challenges and Trends in the Jewish Encounter with the Modern World. And she's currently working on a new book on the history of DC area Jews and their political activism. So welcome, Lauren, and thank you so much. And our second panelist, Guila Franklin Siegel, who many of you know, she is the Associate Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Washington, also known as JCRC. Prior to joining JCRC, Guila was the founding director of Tikkun Olam Women's Foundation of Greater Washington, an organization that a number of us at Bethel are active in. It's a Jewish grant-making organization focused on empowering women, philanthropists, and supporting social change for women and girls. She has over 20 years experience in Jewish-grounded public policy and community relations. She previously served on the staffs of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, Panim, and the American Jewish Congress. She's a frequent writer on a range of Jewish issues, and her pieces have appeared in The Forward, the Telegraphic Agency, Kveller, the New York Jewish Week, and our own Washington Jewish Week. So thank you both for taking the time out of your busy schedules to talk with us today. And I'm going to ask Dr. Strauss, if you could start us off by talking a bit about the history of Black-Jewish relations in the United States and how that history sheds light on today's questions.
Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here and very honored. It's been quite a week. I don't need to tell anyone that. And so it really does seem quite appropriate that we're here together on a beautiful day. And so I want to thank Bethel and especially note that it's wonderful that this is being sponsored by Sisterhood, by a women's organization. And, this is all about talking about marginalized voices and bringing parts of the community together who have historically not been in positions of authority to decide their own fate or to decide the course of the discussion. And I also have to say that it's really fun and to be doing this with Guila, who I'll just tell everyone publicly, she's one of my closest friends, and so the two of us, without an audience, have had many hours of discussion about these issues, and it's something that we both just care so deeply about, and we are always in a process of educating each other. Guila's really one of my heroes, and so it's really nice to let more people in on that conversation. So this is complicated. Everything is complicated, and we're only realizing recently just how complicated some of these issues are. And I find it very, very helpful to understand always the background of issues and relationships between groups of people, and kind of check our own narratives. And it's often harder to educate people who know a lot about one part of an issue. And so it's really challenging on both sides. And of course, there's more than two sides in this issue. But there are a lot of sensitivities, really understandably. And everybody needs to appreciate and realize that there are deeply felt, sort of long-standing impressions of different groups and what different groups and individuals from those groups have done for and against others. And so it's hard. And so I really commend everybody for entering into a process that's not necessarily so easy. So I'm going to start, as I do usually, in the early 20th century. There are things you can say about the years of Jews in America leading up to that, Jews around the Civil War, etc. But that's not really our main objective here. But it's important, really important for us to look at the early 20th century, which is before most kind of overviews of American Jews and Blacks relationship will begin. And that is because there is a significant and multi-tiered relationship there. On the one hand, you have Jews who were here mostly since the mid to late 19th century, coming from Central Europe, from Germany, Austria, especially parts of Poland. And by the turn of the 20th century, many, not all, but many of those Jews were well integrated, relatively in a financial sense, not so much in a social sense. Anti-Semitism is on the rise from white America, but we're not dealing with that right now. And many of the Jews in this group really quite naturally turned to the Black community in America as potential recipients for philanthropy, and they were very, very interested in them. So just to cite the most notable examples of Jewish involvement and and philanthropy in the direction of the African American community, we have the Rosenwald schools that were founded by Sears Roebuck founder Julius Rosenwald, a German Jew, and these were schools, over 5,000 of them, that were built in mostly in rural Black areas in America, and to provide education, real education, at a time when there were no mandates from the government or from the courts to make sure that Black students in the South and elsewhere had equal access, or really any access, to books, to a roof over their head, to have an education, and a safe place in which to do it. So these Rosenwald schools are one example of very important philanthropic effort. And the other one I'll mention from the early 20th century, from the German Jewish perspective, is that that people like the Spingarn family, Joel Spingarn, others, were very, very involved in the founding of the NAACP. They were the founders, along with Black Americans, of the NAACP, which for a long time was really the only significant advocacy group on advocating on behalf of the rights of Black Americans. There were also a lot of connections from this group in terms of arts and culture. A lot of Jews who funded efforts and publications coming out of the Harlem Renaissance, for instance, in the 1920s. Also, in the early part of the century, though, we have the example, a much richer actually, and fuller example, and one that is almost not known at all, of the relationship between East European Jewish immigrants, mostly Yiddish-speaking immigrants, and Black America. Of course, by now, by the early 20th century, we have an incredible influx of Jewish immigrants mostly from Eastern Europe, but also still continuing from Central Europe and to some extent from the Ottoman Empire, et cetera. But between the approximate 40-year period between the early 1880s and the time that immigration is shut in this country in the early 1920s, we have about 2.5 million Jews immigrating. And this is about 10% of total immigrants coming to this country in that period. So it's an overwhelming number. And they arrive, and as I said, most of them are originally Yiddish speakers. And very early on, they start to sense a real sense of kinship and connection in very intimate, personal ways between their own stories, their own positions in society, and the Black American community. And you see this articulated in the Yiddish press, and in letters to the editor, and in activism. The Yiddish press, not only the largest newspaper, the Yiddish Daily Vorwärts, but also, which was founded in 1897, but also the communist Yiddish newspaper, the Freiheit, which became the Morgen Freiheit in the 1920s. You see here that these papers, and Der Tag, which is more mainstream, these papers cover Black America, and especially events that have to do with persecution, like race riots and lynchings, far, far more than any English language or other language press in this country, with the exception of the specifically Black press coming out of Harlem and other neighborhoods, also DC. And what's really fascinating is one of my colleagues in New York, the historian Hasia Diner, noted in a book she wrote a couple of decades ago. She went through the Yiddish press and realized that they not only cover these events, but they transform them into a Jewish language, into part of the Jewish experience, so that the word used in the Yiddish press to describe race riots in America is pogrom. The word used to describe lynching is auto da fe, which is the event during the Spanish Inquisition and other inquisitions when people were burned at the stake in the middle of the town square. And it is analogous. But the fact that they linguistically could have found other words shows the incredible personal connection that they felt. And it's not only that, it's in activism also. It's in the organizing of particularly left-wing, but not only left-wing, Jews into organizations that are advocating for the passage of an anti-lynching bill in the Senate, which, believe it or not, did not pass. The Solid South stood against the passage of such a bill. And if you look at Yiddish illustrated publications, which is partly what I'm writing a book on right now, and their left-wing activism, there are many, many examples of Jewish artists, left-wing mostly artists, activists, who put themselves into lithographs and paintings of lynchings, etc. And they draw connections visually between the experience of Jews in Russia and also persecution of Jews in America and the experience of Black Americans. So there are really a lot of examples. So that gets to the next major connection, and that is that they not only saw themselves in the position societally of Black Americans, but they identified racially as well. And so we need to keep in our minds, and this is something that Guila and I will come back to later, just keep in your minds that this was not a time when the question, are Jews white, ever really came up. The answer was almost universally, no, they're not. This was from the Jewish community and also from those who evaluated them and treated them in certain ways, from immigration restrictionists who talked about these dark hordes coming to American shores from Russia and Southern Europe, etc. So that really was coming up at the time. Also, the left in general, the political left in general, especially in the 20s and 30s, has as part of its program, as part of its directives, if you're talking about the Communist Party, but not only them, the idea of interaction between races and ethnicities, so that this was really the only forum in which you would see multiracial social events, etc. And Jews were front and center in all of these. So moving to the middle of, closer to the middle of the 20th century, we have before the marquee events of the civil rights movement that you may be more familiar with, we have already in the late 40s and early and mid 50s, we have an extraordinary dedication on the part of establishment Jewish communities like AJ Committee and AJ Congress, a dedication to striking down in the courts the apparatus of racism in this country and fighting civil rights battles in the courts. We have civil rights training going on. There's a great picture that I show when I do illustrated lectures of women, essentially they would call themselves housewives at the time in the 1950s in Miami, undergoing civil disobedience training to go out and advocate on behalf of civil rights. And Jewish women held the first sit-in at a lunch counter before the famous Greensboro sit-in at a lunch counter in the 1950s. And so there are tons of examples like that, sort of lower down on the radar. We also have a number of aspects that should be recognized from that time of the Black community really coming forward to advocate for Jews, which Jews needed advocacy at the time. In a little bit earlier in the 1940s, during the war and right after the war, we see HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, coming forth and initiating programs to help get Jewish scholars out of Nazi Germany and other countries in Hitler's Europe. We had some here at Howard University and elsewhere. But we also see Jews, the Jewish community on both sides of many issues, starting pretty early on in this process. For instance, we see the most famous development in terms of literally development as in housing development in terms of the suburbanization in this country that really took off after the war. We see the most storied development, of course, is Levittown, especially New York, but the first one was actually in Pennsylvania. And that really brings us to a great example of Jews, American Jews, being on both sides of an issue. On the one hand, we have this vast neighborhood being built by Bill Levitt, who is a World War II veteran and was genius, I guess, in repurposing resources and building materials left over after the war. And he plans these communities basing it on the GI Bill and on this, great expansion of opportunity for people to have access to housing, etc. But Levittown, as many of you I'm sure know, upholds restrictive covenants that don't, in this case, keep out Jews like many other neighborhoods do, but that keep out Black families. In some places officially, in some places unofficially, but with neighborly pressure. And so that's on the one hand. And on the other hand, we also have Jews at the forefront of being the people who are the first to fight to integrate not only Levittowns, but other racially restricted neighborhoods. So we have the Wexlers, for instance, who are self-described red diaper babies, Jewish children of East European immigrants who work sort of clandestinely to sell, use a white family to sell as a front the first neighborhood, the first house in a restricted neighborhood to a Black couple, and incurring all kinds of protests, et cetera. So we really see in housing, and we see it through to today, real estate policies, the involvement of American Jews in all different aspects. We also see greater diffraction of the American Jewish community when we look at regional differences. And we can talk about this a little bit more later. And it's not even as simple as saying Northern Jews felt this way and Southern Jews felt this way. It has become sort of in vogue to look at recent research that acknowledges that Southern Jews were often not so thrilled to have Northern university students, galloping in on white horses into their communities and striking and demonstrating in the streets, and then leaving again and sort of leaving them to pick up the pieces of their community. And so that has been perceived as a kind of a statement by Southern Jews that they are against racial justice. That's not fair, really. There are definitely people who could look at it in that way, but we also need to consider, on the one hand, the degree of danger that, frankly, some of these people were in. The bombing of the temple in Atlanta in 1958 is the most famous such incident, but there were dozens of death threats against Southern rabbis and heads of congregations at this time if they took a public stance on civil rights. And on the other hand, there were many, many actions by Southern Jews to welcome their Black neighbors in ways that other people in the community didn't. Stores serving local Black customers when other stores wouldn't, et cetera, et cetera. And we can, as I said, we can go into that. And meanwhile, you see dastardly statements of outright racism from some in Northern Jewish communities. So everything is complicated. And of course, in the middle of the 20th century, we have the marquee events that I referred to before. We have 1961, the Freedom Riders. And if you look at research, the sort of accepted number that research tells us, although this can't really be confirmed, is that out of the white people, and here I am including Jews in that group, somewhat controversially. If you look at or non-African Americans who are participating in the freedom rides of the summer of '61 to integrate the interstate bus system, especially in this country, it is said, with pretty good evidence, it is said that 2/3 of the riders who were not from the Black community were Jewish. This is at a time when Jews constituted about generously 4% of the population. So we're really saying that 66% of people who were not Black who got on those buses and literally risked their lives to integrate the interstate bus system were Jews. Very largely, in large part, college students, clergy, and also other people. So that's something to hold on to. And then, of course, we look at the martyrs of the civil rights movement, most notably Michael Schwerner and Andrew Goodman, and their colleague James Chaney, African American from Mississippi, who were the three civil rights workers affiliated with CORE, Congress on Racial Equality, who were murdered by the Klan in the summer of '64. And we have Selma in 65. We have Dr. King and Rabbi Heschel marching hand in hand. We have Dr. Joachim Prinz, my rabbi, and his friend Martin Luther King, advocating and also speaking, both Dr. Prince and King speaking at the March on Washington. Those are the big events, but it's important that we realize that there's a lot going on in small ways also. And again, so this is just a really quick overview with a lot to cover. We can go back to any of this if you want later on. And then, of course, we have the what is often seen as the fracturing of the Black-Jewish relationship, which I have to say recent scholarship is making this more complicated as well. As it gets toward the end of the 60s, Malcolm X was assassinated already in 65, but people often focus on the year 67 as a real breaking point. In some ways, it certainly is. You have the 6-Day War with American Jews really coming out in droves in ways that they never had before in support of Israel. And also at the same time, the Black Power movement being very openly pro-Palestinian, and at a time when that was just simply not done in the Jewish community. And then finally, we have some other controversial events that again complicate the discussion. We have the Ocean Hill-Brownsville school controversy of 1968, when on the one hand, we see that teachers, that the local school board in an almost entirely Black school district of Brooklyn wants to take matters of their education into their own hands. They're not getting the resources they need, et cetera. And so there is a local sort of takeover of the school board, which was happening elsewhere as well. And on the other hand, we see the UFT, the United Federation of Teachers, headed by Jew, representing almost entirely Jews, New York public school system at that time, reacting very negatively to this and calling it anti-Semitic when a group of teachers, almost entirely Jewish, are transferred out of that school system. Lots of ugliness ensues. There are lots of good and bad points to be made on both sides. But the point is that this is another flashpoint where communities are very justified at feeling that their interests are not being respected by people in the society in general, and are often taking it out on each other in their rhetoric. And there is ugly rhetoric on both sides. We see this in 1991 in the Crown Heights riots that I'm sure many of you remember, when the motorcade taking the Rebbe, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Menachem Mendel Schneerson, to his headquarters, accidentally strikes two young boys, Black immigrants, and kills a 7-year-old. And the ensuing riots in the Black community, we see a lot of, frankly, anti-Semitic rhetoric, and a student, a visiting yeshiva student, Yankel Rosenbaum, is stabbed to death. And again, there are recriminations on both sides. New York local politics are brought into it. David Dinkins at the time is mayor. Jewish lack of enthusiasm overall for Dinkins is seen as one of the factors contributing to the anger of the Black neighborhood. And again, there's just so much complexity here. Finally, I'll end with two other sort of complex things. One really positive, I think, and one not so positive. Not so positive one, very, very recent, right here in DC, in about 2.5 years ago, in the spring of 2018, we saw Councilman Trayon White repeating conspiracy theories, attributing the power of the Jew to control the weather. As I'm sure you all remember. If we do, then we did a great job today, I have to say. And that, of course, led to really the opening of a Pandora's box of the extent to which really horrendous conspiracy theories some benign and laughable, maybe like that, benign seeming and laughable, but some so horrendous as to echo medieval Jewish blood libel charges are really rampant in some communities. And again, obviously Guila and her office was very involved in this. I can let her address this. But it's complicated how each community responds, and asking, why is that? Why is that those ideas of the other exist? Why is there so much of a lack of communication and so few bridges that exist to speak to each other and provide a voice and a face, so that people aren't only relying on conspiracy theories? And then the positive one that I have to evoke, partly because of this week and partly because this is sponsored by Sisterhood, is the creation of the National Women's Political League. That's not the actual name, but close it. It's a long name. That was founded in the early 1970s by a handful of women who wanted to change this country in a lot of ways and wanted to address race and gender and economic inequality. It was founded by a few people with names like Bella Abzug and Gloria Steinem and Shirley Chisholm. And that really set the groundwork that still exists for dialogue between people in these disparate communities. It's been really tested recently, and again, especially in the women's movement, and Guila can speak to that. But really, that was an example of people, women, coming together when already the rest of society was saying, oh, this is a lost cause. It's after the 60s. These are disparate communities. They aren't speaking to each other. Jews are rich, Jews are white, blacks are this, blacks are that. And yet these people, these incredible political leaders who really understood complexity, came together to forge an organization that made a lot of strides. So I will stop there. Believe it or not, there's a 10 more, and have Guila address some of these issues as well, and tell us what we can do about it.
Thanks, Lauren. Lauren's not kidding when she says that we talk about this all the time. And I have to say, Lauren's not on Facebook. So she doesn't even know that when I posted something about this on Friday, what I said was, please join us. Actually, Lauren and I talk about this all the time. We're just inviting you to listen to us and talk to us. Right. So we are completely on the same wavelength at all times. And it's so much fun to be here. And I want to thank our friends at Bethel for inviting us to be here to talk about such an important topic that is so, other than this week, is so front and center on our minds. Two things I want to say at the outset. The first thing is, I think on this topic, there are a lot of spaces and where I think the operating proposition is that not every question is okay, and that some questions are off limits and we're not allowed to express our deepest concerns and fears for fear of offending. I want to let you know that as far as I am concerned, I encourage you to speak frankly and to share your responses, your fears, your concerns. I think we need to talk about it. And I actually think the inhibition of talking about it sometimes paralyzes us and makes us unable to move forward. The second thing I want to comment about at the outset is when, people talk about blacks and Jews. And, that may have been very easy to do decades and decades ago. But I think it's important to recognize the fact that 7% of our local community in the greater Washington area are comprised of Jews of color. And that for those people, it's not such a clear delineation. They experience life every day as both Jews and as people of color. And so these distinctions begin to recede in in relevance and meaning when there are increasing members of our community who themselves identify that way, and also increasing members of our community who have loved ones who identify in that way and who have children who identify in that way. So please take everything I'm saying in that context. I wanted to start in recognition. I would be remiss if I didn't invoke the memory of Rabbi Jonathan Sacks this morning, because yesterday, in addition to this enormous epochal event in American history, we also lost a true Eloi, the Jewish people did, one of our greatest teachers and thinkers of this generation, who left us way too soon. And one of the areas in which he was so influential about was the intersection of Jews with the world around them. How do we live as Jews and as human beings? And there was an anti-Semitic event on a London Underground train several years ago that he responded to, because the person who stood up for the Jewish people who were being harassed was a Muslim woman. And he wrote that we in Britain should still be talking about anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, or racism at all is deeply shocking. But it reminds us of the distance between public utterances of politicians and the reality. And it's been like that for a very long time. Thomas Jefferson, who drafted the line in the American Declaration of Independence, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal," was a slave owner. We still have to fight for the truth that every group should feel safe, and that our differences, not just our similarities, are what make us human. The Bible taught this in its opening chapter by saying that every human being is in the image and likeness of God, meaning that one who is not in my image, whose color, culture, or creed is not mine, is nonetheless in God's image. And that is the ethos in which I was raised. I'm 52. I was raised in the 70s in Brooklyn, the site of that teacher strike in Brownsville, and in the 80s, during the Crown Heights riots, during Al Sharpton's regular invective against the Jewish community. And yet I was raised in a community that was both conservadox, fiercely Zionist, and fiercely dedicated to the civil rights movement and to equality for all people. My parents were observant Jews. They were disabled, and they taught me that Martin Luther King was our greatest American hero. And all of those things gelled. I went to Orthodox day school. I was marched proudly in the Salute to Israel parade every year. And I was such a dork that when I got to hold my high school's banner my senior year and I made it into the Daily News, I was so excited. So that's the world that I grew up in, where these things needed to come together as a matter of Jewish values and principle. Somehow, we're in a very different place now. And my greatest observation through my work over the last couple of years is that somehow both Blacks and Jews feel that in order not only to acknowledge the narrative of the other, but also to acknowledge our role in the other person's narrative, our presence in that narrative, for good and for bad, as Lauren was speaking about, is to chip away from our own authenticity, our own pride, our own dignity, our own, self-determination. And I think that's a stumbling block sometimes. And I would like to offer this morning a different framework that can help us to rethink how we approach these issues in a way that doesn't leave us feeling as conflicted or resentful or hesitant. And that allows us to bring our full selves to the table wherever we go. So I want to start off by saying that the JCRC is very comfortable saying that Black Lives Matter. And in a minute, I'm going to get into what Black Lives Matter is and what it isn't. But I think we need to take as an operating premise what I always say to people, which is, if you've heard of the phrase driving while Black, I propose to you that there is no such thing as driving on I-270 while being an Ashken normative Jew. That is not a thing. But what is a thing is sending our kids off to college campuses where, when they self-identify as both progressive activists and as proud liberal Zionist Jews, they are harassed. That's a thing. A Hasidic Jew walking in Hasidic garb down the street in Crown Heights who gets beaten to an inch of his life, that's a thing. And our ability to hold these true truths in our hands, that for Ashken normative Jews, we will never get pulled over on I-270 wrongfully because we don't identify, our skin color allows us to identify as white people. And I say that as for Ashken normative Jews, not for Jews of color, not for Mizrahi Jews. If we can hold that and understand that that is a privilege, and that acknowledging that privilege does not take away from our history and from our current zeitgeist of an alarming, terrifying rise in anti-Semitism and in anti-Israel activism, if we can do that and hold those truths in our hands together, we can move our community forward as Jews and as Americans. So I want to talk about what Black Lives Matter is and what it isn't. Black Lives Matter is a value. Black lives should matter. If I put the word should in there, you understand that it's a statement of belief and of value. Black lives should matter. And right now, they don't matter as much as other lives do. My father, Zichrono Livracha, used to say in his classic Brooklyn blunt way, Jewish blood is cheap. That is how I was raised. I was raised in a community of Holocaust survivors. And he wasn't wrong throughout the course of history. We, above all people, understand what it is like to walk around feeling that your life matters less and that the world looks away when lives are lost wrongfully and when our people are treated in a humiliating fashion that denigrates their essential humanity. Black Lives Matter means that is a statement of values that racial justice is something we have not attained in this society yet. And that we as Americans, because we are Americans, need, as all other Americans need to, stop fighting against this reality and be a part of getting us to a better place. It's a hashtag. It's a statement of values and principles. Why is this so essential right now? The prominence of that movement has exploded in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. But the issue of inequity and of racial injustice in the United States goes far beyond police brutality and criminal justice reform. It is seared onto the life experience of Black Americans from the time that they are born. And that is why JCRC is incredibly active in educational equity, for example. There's only one way to understand the fact that in Montgomery County Public Schools, when math tests are administered to determine who gets invited to be on the accelerated math track, Black kids and white kids may score the same on that test. The white kids are invited to participate in the accelerated math track exponentially higher rate than the Black kids. because the invitation is subjective. And that's just one example of many of messages that Black people get from the time that they are little, that they are less than, and that they don't have the same opportunities available to them, and that they need to live with vulnerability and fear that other people do not. We see it in the disparity in maternal mortality rates. We've seen it over the last 8 months in the horrific disparity in COVID infection rates and mortality rates in the communities of color versus other communities. This is something that is a reality in American society. We are Americans. We need to care. What is Black Lives Matter not? Black Lives Matter is not an organized, solitary movement. And I don't want to spend too much time getting into the specifics of that, because I understand that Jana and Sharon and Allison put out a link to the JCRC page. We have a whole page of resources that talks about the intersection of racism and anti-Semitism with some fabulous background information, including information sheets from the Jewish Council for Public Affairs and the Jewish Federations of North America, explaining this very difficult concept. But I'll just summarize it, which is that there is no one Black Lives Matter movement. It is a fractured, incredibly local specific, loose movement, if you can even call it that. It looks very different in each community. And there are several different national kind of umbrella organizations that have adopted some portion of that name into their name. So there's something called the Movement for Black Lives. And several years ago, the Movement for Black Lives, in its foundation document, adopted a clause that supported the boycotting of Israel. Very, very, very disturbing. And everyone, I think, acknowledges that the Movement for Black Lives has no direct connectivity to anything in anyone's local community. Black Lives Matter looks and feels very different in every community. As a matter of fact, the JCRC director in Charleston was one of the founders of his local Black Lives Matter movement. Unfortunately, here in DC, the Black Lives Matter DC movement is not a movement that is hospitable to working with Jews and that is open to working with Jews. That is very unfortunate. And that's not just JCRC, it's Jews United for Justice. It's problematic. But saying that doesn't mean that we don't fundamentally ascribe to the philosophy and the value that Black Lives Matter. It means that we don't work with that particular group, and we have other partners with whom we work and with whom we have always worked to promote racial justice and to get at the roots of systemic institutional racism. What else is Black Lives Matter not? Black Lives Matter doesn't necessarily mean that you believe in defunding the police. Many people believe that it's an all or nothing proposition. It is not. The JCRC does not support something called defunding the police, and I'm not even sure what that really means. But that's not something that we support. The concept of saying Black Lives Matter is much broader than any one set of remedies. And, a range of organizations might come out to address with specific policy recommendations for how to address police reform. What JCRC comes out with, and we are right now engaging in a process of evaluating what that policy should look like and what we should be recommending to our state and local legislatures, may be very different than what Jews United for Justice or Project Zero or any other organization that is engaged in this space might support. But everyone should and can have a space in which they can and should feel comfortable advocating for racial justice, because systemic and institutional racism is baked into the soil of this country. And I often say, just as anti-Semitism is baked into the soil in Europe. And we can't remove ourselves from that discussion. What else does Black Lives Matter not mean? Black Lives Matter doesn't mean that we need to swallow or ignore our very real vulnerability and fears about anti-Semitism and about the really horrific, outrageous demonization and delegitimization of Israel. Not for 1 second. Our work for justice can only be meaningful if it is done authentically and with our whole selves. And I think this is where things have broken down over the last few years. And truthfully, I think everyone bears part of the blame for that. I don't agree with the statement, we just need to agree to disagree and not talk about it. I feel like it's the elephant in the room, and it's unrealistic. Because the experience of the Holocaust is not very old, it is very fresh. And just as racism and Jim Crow and segregation and police brutality are seared onto the souls of Black Americans, the Holocaust, anti-Semitism, vulnerability about Israel, they're seared into our souls. That is our narrative. And we can't relinquish that either, nor should we be asked to. And when we are, we lose a piece of ourselves. And we don't bring the full value of what we have to offer to the fight for racial justice to the table. I think that my experiences in this space, and I wrote about the Women's March long before other people did, are enlightening in that regard. When I was at the first Women's March, I suspect a lot of people on this call were. And I fully supported everything about it. There were rumblings that there were people involved at the organizing level who were either at best uninformed about Jewish identity, about anti-Semitism, and about Israel. We moved forward. A year later, it seemed that the problems had already been exacerbated. I wrote a column then saying that I was concerned. 2 years later, everything had blown up. Why? And I wrote again. And I say this with all due respect for all of my colleagues throughout organized Jewish life. I think there does come a point where you can't always be at the table. Every person draws that line in a different place. My argument to you today is that you need to be super careful in where you draw it, and that you have to err on the side of being at the table. But that doesn't mean that we can never be at the table. And where I drew the line was a situation where these people have been aware of the concerns and issues that the Jewish community had for years. And the lines of communication had been kept open, and there had been a chance given. And at some point, you have to give these folks enough respect to know that they understand, they get it. They're making a deliberate choice about the policies they espouse, about their phraseology, about the things they say and the decisions that they make. And the JCRC at that time thought long and hard, and we issued an advisory to the community that said, we cannot, this march is on Shabbat, but even if it wasn't, we could not actively endorse people from our community going to the march. Fast forward to this past summer, and there was a lot of heartfelt dispute. I felt very lonely in some of those, it's at that time, because I was surrounded by people who felt differently. But I just felt that that was a place I couldn't go. Even though I have dedicated my life's work to combating all forms of hatred. Interestingly, I think that sticking to our guns made a difference. And eventually, those leaders were pushed out of the movement. They were forced to step down. I often said, if leaders of a for-profit corporation had brought that much negative attention onto their business, they would have been told to step down a long time ago. And if you fast forward to this summer, a remarkable thing happened. And I leave you with this because I want to leave time for questions. Over the summer, after maybe a month after George Floyd was killed, Deshaun Jackson, a very prominent NFL player, and Nick Cannon, a very prominent celebrity, both said anti-Semitic things. I'm telling you, I think 3 or 4 years ago, nobody would have said anything. It would have been, the response would have been very muted. I know that to be the case because, there were things that have happened 3 and 4 years ago that I was appalled by, and no one said anything. But an interesting thing happened. This time, prominent Black people came out and spoke against what Deshaun Jackson and Nick Cannon had said. And we saw an op-ed by Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and an op-ed by Jamal Hill, all of them not just acknowledging anti-Semitism, but especially in Jamal Hill's case, placing herself in our narrative and saying, this is how my community, my people perceived Jews when we were growing up. And we need to be able to name that and say that. And I don't think that would have happened without the Black Lives Matter movement, because the Black Lives Matter movement, in the end, I hope and I believe, is creating greater accountability for everybody about hatred. And there's an understanding that you can't expect everybody to be out in the streets marching and then espouse hatred toward another group that has also a narrative, a peoplehood narrative that is replete with pain and death and violence and dehumanization. So I think that we are inextricably linked, and that for values-related purposes and practical purposes, self-interest purposes, we must engage in this dialogue and in this fight. And we must do it without giving an inch of who we are as a people and who we are as lovers of Israel, who I know I would put myself in front of a moving train for Israel. And we need to do both. We need to walk and chew gum at the same time. It's not always easy, but I think we can do it. And I will now turn it back to Jana.
Thank you, Guila, and thank you, Lauren, for those amazing, powerful, heartfelt remarks. Wow. So I'm going to ask Pam to open the chat. So she has opened the chat, so folks can pose questions. Let me just pose one question, I think mostly to you, Guila, but welcome Lauren's response as well. Can you say a little bit more about the notion of white privilege, especially Jews and white privilege? Because I think that is a term that's confusing and perhaps disconcerting to many people. So can you say a little bit more about kind of what you mean by white privilege? And you said a little bit when you talked about not having to worry about driving while Jewish, but maybe just elaborate a little bit, and then we'll take questions from other folks.
So this is something Lauren and I talk a lot about, and we don't have exactly the same point of view, so it'll be interesting to hear Lauren's comments as well. From my perspective, I feel that the concept of privilege is oversimplified in this country. I often say we really have to stop just talking about white privilege, because it's white, Christian, straight, able privilege, okay, and male, frankly. And so again, I don't think that it detracts from um, uh, Jewish identity to say that whether you call us white or passing white, that we have a privilege, the Ashkenormative Jews do, that inures with that. That privilege is only good until it's not good, because we're still not Christian. And some of us are women, and some of us are gay, and some of us are disabled. And so our privilege gets chipped away. And I think we lose something when we get into these disputes about whether we're white or not white. We are who we are. The privilege we have is real. It has its limitations. We know it has its limitations. So it doesn't take, I don't feel diminished at all by saying, I have white privilege. I have privilege. I know I have privilege. You know, I don't have to have that talk with my son about putting his hands on the dashboard if he gets pulled over by the cops. On the other hand, I do have to have the talk with my son when he goes off to college campus about how to deal with anti-Semitism and people who hassle him because he is a progressive Zionist. So I think that, again, we shouldn't let that bog us down. I think we need to be honest about our blessings, our manifold blessings here as Americans, and not let that make us feel guilty about talking about the ways in which we aren't privileged. And I offer as an example, there was years and years and years ago, I had to speak to a group of Black ministers at the Annie E. Casey Foundation in Baltimore. And I was talking about a church state issue that was very hot at the time called charitable choice in the Bush administration. This involved giving government dollars to houses of worship to provide social services. And the Jewish community was very opposed to this because in areas where the only service provider would be a house of worship, there was a concern that Jewish people, the only place they could access services was in a church that might evangelize. And so it really seemed to us a problem of separation of church and state that would negatively impact Jewish people in real time. And I was talking to this group of Black ministers who, for very understandable reasons, really supported charitable choice. And I had to be up there explaining why this was an issue for Jews. And I was in the minority at that time. I was the only non-Christian in the room. And so everybody else in that room, the people that they represented, could very comfortably access social services in a church for the most part, by their accounts. The people I represented were going to have a problem with that. And they were going to feel under attack and marginalized and deprived of rights because some Jews inevitably were not going to accept services, drug rehab services or what have you, in a place where they were being proselytized. And so I think privilege is a fluid thing. And we need to be willing to feel comfortable with the privilege we do have, like I said, accept those blessings and understand their limitations.
Yeah.
Do you want to add anything?
Just to pick up on one of the last things that Guila said about privilege being fluid, I know that it's already, this train has left the station, right? We're not going to put back in a closet somewhere the idea of talking about white privilege and skin color in this country, nor should we. But I do want people to either get away from or at least be aware that when they talk about racial justice and white privilege and all of these terms, that in America, especially looking at our history, you're really not talking about a biological fact exclusively. You are, to some degree, as Guila says, driving while Black, etc. Although Guila and I had a little difference of opinion on the phone the other day about the fact that I don't know if you could tell that she's from New York, but I know she hides it well, but spending all your life in the New York area, now in DC, where people with dark curly hair are maybe olive skin are not necessarily discriminated against if they're not obviously Black, is very different. When I hear from friends of mine who have grown up in pretty lily white areas of the country, it is different. And a friend of mine recently was telling me that he's an Ashkenazi Jew, and he has a lot of trauma actually from growing up where he did in a different part of this country, and constantly being accused of shoplifting and 7-Elevens and things like that erroneously, and all these things. He had a very different experience than people who grew up in very multi-ethnic areas, lots of Jews and Italians, etc. So being white looks different in different parts of the country. But aside from that, I think that people need to get away from thinking about race and the language of race as a purely appearance-based thing, and really look at it as a matter of class and opportunity, which it really always has been in this country. And the fact that, look, Irish immigrants were not considered white when they arrived, certainly in the mid 19th century, the Know Nothing Party, and Irish there was a language calling them non-white, and so and if you look at most Irish people, they are on the surface pretty white, and they're not going to get stopped and pulled over for the same reasons. But the language of privilege in this country and the and sort of granting of privileges has not always been so clearly tied to skin color. As I said, early in the 20th century, most Jews, certainly East European Jews, were neither considered white, nor did they consider themselves white, etc. So, that changes over time, and it's really much more a function of opportunity and institutionalized difference in treatment than it is biological. There's a whole, language of passing, for instance. And the other thing about it is that, and Guila, you definitely touched on this when you talk about bringing your whole selves to the table, that it's not a contest. That even if, and we really need to remember this when you sit down with somebody who you feel is representing a different group, and especially if you feel that there's an adversarial relationship there, you don't need to go into a whole soliloquy about how you aren't really white and that you really have more in common with, so-and-so. That's not really the point, nor is it the point of the other person if they're representing the African-American community to prove that they are experience more overt discrimination on the streets in America. That's obvious. All Americans of any political stripes, should know that by now, from this summer, if not before. That's not the point. The point is to put out there why these things affect you and what your experiences are. Not that yours are worse than theirs or that theirs are worse than yours, but that these are very real and that these need to be acknowledged. And and Guila understandably keeps bringing up the predicament or the position of being a pro-Israel college kid right now. She and I, both, as it happens, the same college, have kids who have, to put it mildly, experienced this and have had real challenges. And it's important that when my kids and Guila's kids sit down with people and try to have dialogue on campus, that they say, look, I'm not trying to pull rank here. I'm not trying to say that because the Holocaust actually murdered 6 million people and slavery was horrible, but it didn't, but it didn't put people in ovens. There are these attempts from people in the Jewish community and elsewhere to have this, to try to quantify whose suffering was worse, and well, but yours lasted longer, and it just, save time. I don't even go there. Just say, look, we both have experienced trauma, and in fact, we are uniquely situated to talk about it and to understand it. So let's get rid of all of that and start to talk to each other. The problem exists, first of all, coming from us, where we don't see that there are legitimate grievances on both sides. And legitimate grievances also with grievances against our community, from, for instance, the Black community, and also where people won't talk to us. And again, this is something that's become institutionalized on college campuses. There are many instances where, for instance, my daughter at her college was just bent over backwards to dialogue with different progressive groups. And this is a kid who, has a lot of progressive credentials, and was also known on her college campus as a Zionist, and in fact has since made Aliyah and is in Israel now. And so the word was sent out among many organizations on her college campus not to speak to her or any organization that she belonged to. And so, there's a lot there. On the one hand, you have to, as Guila says, bring your full self, say, this is who I am, I've experienced trauma, I'm not trying to one up you, we all have this, let's, forget about that and talk about it. On the other hand, it's hard when people won't talk to you. And that's when I think the turning point in the last few years that Guila referred to really comes into play. And that is, go public. And speak out and say to people, hey, I want to talk about this, and you're making certain assumptions about me or my community, and some are right and some are wrong. But if you purport to be a person or an organization who cares about discrimination and cares about minority voices and cares about violence against minorities, then you need to put your money where your mouth is and come and speak to the Jews, and this is why. And I think that there was a timidity in the Jewish community until recently. I give Guila a whole lot of credit for dealing with the Women's March, the third Women's March, and she was lonely, and it was really a lonely position to be in. But I think that there's been a sea change, and it has been because there have been people in the Jewish community, I try to do this in my classes and with my students, who are trying to walk this very, very careful line between not being superior, not throwing all this history of like, oh, but we did this for you and we did that for you, and by the way, have you heard of the Holocaust? And not doing that in a superior way, but doing that in a way to explain that these are unnegotiable parts of our identity, who we are, and holding people to their statements and saying, if you really believe in all of these things that you say about society, then you need to include anti-Semitism in your litany of prejudices that you fight against, etc. Say that loud, say that in op-eds, keep going. And I think incrementally there's a little bit of change there happening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Strauss and Guila. So folks, we are getting some questions in now. Thank you for the confusion. Any additional questions, if you could send them directly to Allison, and I am going to, I know Doreen and Lila were asking questions about college campuses, which I think Dr. Strauss covered. If you have follow-ups, please feel free to just send that to me. Alana asks Lauren and Guila, possibly because we are more attuned to the areas of conflict between Jews and Blacks now, or because there's just so much more media. I feel there was more vocal leadership joining the two causes 50 to 70 years ago. Rabbi Heschel and Reverend King, is there something else to do, or are we seeing a dearth of vocal or compelling leaders to bring the two groups together more?
I would say that there's always more to do. There's much more that we can and should be doing. And I think it's not just leadership. I think it has to be on a person-to-person basis. I think certainly in the Jewish community, there's been, initially there were people who said in Ferguson that the Jewish community did not speak up vocally enough. I don't think that was true when George Floyd was killed. Within 3 days, JCRC had over 100 local organizations signed on to a statement of support and solidarity with the Black community. And I think that also in Congress, there has been a tremendous amount of support among the Jewish delegation for efforts. They've been some of the leaders in pushing for this, people like Jamie Raskin. As far as, are there enough Jewish leaders who are speaking both to the need to be engaged with Black Lives Matter and doing it in a way that makes Jews feel that they're not giving up something of themselves, kind of getting the Jewish community to a place where we don't feel like we need to talk about the Holocaust every 2 seconds when we're talking about Black Lives Matter. Always true. And certainly in the Black community, we struggle with this because it does seem like when something bad happens, like Deshaun Jackson or Nick Cannon, everybody focuses on the thing that was said, and the Black leaders who speak out and criticize what has been said get less traction and attention. And I think that is why after George Floyd was killed, and there were a lot of people on Twitter who were Jewish posting, statements of support that came from Black leaders. I wanted to, if I can, Jana, there was a question that was asked in the chat that I happened to see because it was addressed to everyone, and I'd like to address it because I want to clarify it. And my friend Naomi Edelson says, I do think we're making it hard for Black people to see us as allies when we try to always raise our shared trauma, and I'm struggling with this. I don't think the issue is to always raise our shared trauma. As a matter of fact, I don't think we should. And JCRC has on its website, and I meant to mention this before, a very comprehensive toolkit about racism and about engaging with the issue of racism in the United States. And it's got lists of books and movies and Judaic resources and lists of organizations that you can be active with. And we deliberately did not put the resources about the intersection of anti-Semitism and racism on that page. It is not in the toolkit. It has its own separate page. Why? Because we didn't want people to think that a prerequisite for becoming engaged on Black Lives Matter and in racial justice is, doing this litmus test involving anti-Semitism. I don't think that's what we should do, raising our shared trauma all the time. I think we need to bring our full selves to the table and engage with racial justice with our full hearts, but not be silent when there's something happening that you feel negates you, and don't feel like you need to swallow that. You need to speak up for yourself as you speak up for others.
Right.
And I find that when I do that, it never fails to be a positive thing. So I last year was involved with a controversy called the DC Dyke March, which for those of you who know, takes place during Pride weekend. And it's less establishment, and they banned Jewish pride flags that have the Magen David on it because they said it reminds them looks too much like the Israeli flag. Shocking that the Israeli flag has a Jewish symbol on it that has existed for millennia. Who would have thunk, right? Anyway, so we were down there, and there were these 2 African-American women, and they came up to me and they said, can you explain to me what this whole thing is about? We have no idea because the Dyke March was delayed. The kickoff was delayed for the marching because the marshals were not letting us march and all of this. And I pulled myself out of the group and I just talked to them for 10 minutes and I explained what Israel is, how Israel, is so important to the identity of an overwhelming majority of American Jews, how, just because you support and love the state of Israel doesn't mean you have to agree with everything its current government says. I'm an American at that time. I didn't agree with everything our government at that time was doing. And the person looks at me after 10 minutes and says, thank you so much for explaining that. Like, we had no idea. We don't know what this whole thing is. And wherever I go, that's who I am. I don't slice off a piece of who I am.
You're always subtle. You're
it.
Always subtle. No one ever knows you're in the room. No one knows what makes you.
I'm a wallflower. But I really feel it's not like I'm shouting, look at me.
If I could say something about the Dyke March, that gets to some other issues here. One interesting thing that about that confrontation, really, and Guila has some great footage of it, is that much of the resistance to Guila and her group marching and holding these rainbow flags with Magen David in the center came from Jews at the march, came from other Jews at the march representing certain anti-Zionist groups, et cetera. And without getting into all the complexities there, it's also important to recognize how increasingly it's sort of confusing in the constellation of voices out there, that sometimes there are identity issues that people have coming from within their own sort of complicated relationships to their own background. So that's kind of an interesting blip. But one thing I wanted to say to some of the questions that I also saw coming in through the chat is that we each need to engage this issue in ways that make us feel not comfortable in a sense of complacent, right? You should want a very popular kind of progressive organization injunction is get uncomfortable. They're often kids in civil rights organizations, whatever, are told to put yourself in a place where you're actually uncomfortable, you're challenging your own assumptions. That's not what I mean. That's fine. What I mean is that there are so many ways to deal with this, with these issues, and to address them, and also to contribute and to learn. And I know that we're getting close to time, and so I didn't want to finish without people really sitting back and thinking, long after we turn off this webinar, about the multiplicity of ways that they can learn and that they can give. And if you look at the history of Jews in this issue, being involved in this issue, you see that there is, over time, and this also goes for the experience of American Jews in civic involvement in general, acting as Americans, there's an incredible variety of ways that Jews have and continue to be active in different issues. And one isn't necessarily better than the others. And so you can be an educator, and you can also go to be educated. You can go to lectures, et cetera, and read all of this information that's, of course, especially recently become available. There are legal challenges to specific events that Jewish organizations and individuals as lawyers, et cetera, have become involved in over time. And again, sometimes large constituencies in the Jewish community can be on opposite sides of these issues when it comes to free speech and what lines are drawn. Where do we draw? And we should. There are red lines that you have to draw. For instance, Holocaust denial, not acceptable and under any circumstances. But there are interesting free speech issues. There is lobbying, there is demonstrating in the streets. There are groups, dialogue groups that can be very, very helpful between students. So student to student, I see on campuses, that these are often spaces where kids need to talk to each other about what they're experiencing, not what the grown-ups are telling them. Going into public schools and talking to them about also the history of the different communities, and also, what can be done now. And again, encouraging people to acknowledge it. So there are lots and lots of ways, through the press as well. There are lots and lots of ways of addressing this, and people should look for the way that is, makes the most sense to them in terms of their skills and their and what's available to them. And you can only do so much, but you can do a lot. You can just keep going and keep educating and keep speaking. Either talk to someone in an unplanned public space, like Guila had her conversation with these women at the march who just didn't understand. And I had a really intense conversation Friday morning with a student who's in a seminar that I'm teaching right now, who is African-American from DC and has been exposed to a lot of Farrakhan ideas, and is really, and sees him, and we in the Jewish community have to recognize that many people in the Black community see him as a real advocate for people of color and their champion. Aside from the heinous things he says about LGBT people, whole different ballgame there. And so they don't understand. They don't focus that much on the heinous things that he has said about Jews. And when I tried to explain to this young woman, who I gave her a lot of credit for, first of all, taking my seminar, and then coming forth and saying she wanted to have a one-on-one Zoom conversation with me, when I said, look, you have to understand why the Jewish community sees Farrakhan as one of the leading anti-Semitic voices in this country, she was shocked. She had, in all of the context, the community in which she circulates and all the stuff, she's done extensive reading. No one in her reading list had ever talked about Farrakhan's comments about Jews, because that wasn't relevant to them. They were concerned with, the fact that they saw him as a champion for people of color. And so the only way that she understands where I'm coming from about him in particular, or that I understand what she's been exposed to, is by talking to each other. So you try and you try and you try, and you have people locking you out of meetings, and you have, some incredibly frustrating experiences in high schools and college and beyond. But I think, again, that all of these ways of getting involved are only going to work if we're there, and if we speak up when we see something, and at the same time holding within ourselves the understanding of either that people who are saying things we don't agree with or that we might find offensive are perhaps not party to all the information that we are party to, and starting out with, rather than anger, saying, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but, and constantly being active in whatever forum, we're comfortable in, whether it's writing an op-ed or planning a curriculum.
Thank you so much. I'm mindful of the time. Linda Siegel and others actually asked that question. And I would suggest that Rabbi Abby, maybe if you're comfortable, if you could please put your email in the chat from JCRC. I'll put my email in the chat, and Jana and Allison, if we can direct. I know everyone didn't get to get their questions asked, but I did want to, maybe Guila, hopefully this is a short, easy answer, but it is a question that comes up a lot. Do the speakers consider all anti-Zionism to be anti-Semitism? And is it possible to be anti-Israel without being an anti-Semite?
So yes, it is possible to disagree with the current policies of the state of Israel without being an anti-Semite. That is the short answer. I often phrase it, and I want to be mindful of the fact that the topic of this webinar is not about anti-Israel sentiment and anti-Semitism. It's about Jewish engagement in racial justice. But I will say, for me personally, the shorthand that I always say is, if you want to talk about 67, great. You want to talk about 48, we're in trouble. Because it is about, really the fault line for me is about the right of the Jewish people to self-determination. And that is where anti-Israel activism against current policies of the Israeli government can bleed into anti-Semitism. But again, another discussion for another day to get into in a more concrete way. And I do want to add, as far as the issue of what we can do, the third part of this series, as I'm sure Sharon and Jana and Allison will explain, is about concrete ways to get engaged. And of course, JCRC has a myriad of ways, especially as we approach the beginning of the legislative sessions in Maryland and Virginia, and as we are engaged with all of the legislative proposals that are in the hopper for police reform and our activism on the ground in Montgomery County related to schools, related to children, and related to healthcare. There are so many different ways that we have for you to be engaged and be a part of advancing society and getting us to a better, healthier place.
Can I make one plug, actually? There is an online conversation that's going to be happening this Thursday morning on anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism and that exact question. So this Thursday afternoon, the Center for Israel Studies at American University that I'm affiliated faculty part of, we've been having an online series all semester, and you can watch the past recordings of past panels on anti-Semitism. And the one this coming Thursday is specifically on anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. It's at 12. It's at 11:20 in the morning, and I will send the organizers today the link to that so that you can go and listen to the panel of experts talk about that issue.
Wonderful. And as Guila mentioned, there will be a third session, and it will focus on taking action. And so we'll be able to continue the conversation, and we're going to hear from, during that session, activists and community leaders who are working on some of these issues. And we are just finalizing the scheduling to coordinate the speaker's schedule, but it will be sometime later in November. And if you've registered for any of the sessions, we'll send out information on that as soon as we know the exact dates. And I just want to again thank Guila and Lauren for their incredible insights and passion and ideas about both where we have been and how we can use that history to move forward. And I really appreciate them speaking, and I really look forward to continuing the conversation both at our third session and in some of these other ways that both Guila and Lauren have mentioned. So thank you very much, and enjoy the beautiful weather, and I look forward to seeing many of you later this month at our third session on how to talk about race Jewishly.